Detroit's winter winds cut through Emma's tattered coat as she trudged through the decaying streets. At just 10 years old, her life revolved around survival, scavenging for food scraps and warm corners to spend the night. Her messy auburn hair was tangled beneath a worn beanie, and her hazel eyes carried a mix of determination and sorrow. The city had been unkind to her ever since she had lost her parents in a car accident 2 years prior. Foster homes came and went, none offering the comfort she craved, and eventually, Emma slipped through the cracks, ending up alone. That day, hunger gnawed at her stomach as she ventured into a vacant lot she'd often passed on her wanderings. The lot was filled with discarded tires, broken bottles, and weeds tall enough to hide secrets. Emma hadn't planned to stop, but a faint noise froze her in place. It wasn't the rustle of wind or the scurry of a rat. It was something deeper, a labored breathing that tugged at her curiosity. Carefully, she pushed aside a tangle of brush and froze at what she saw. Tied to a rusted pole was a horse, its coat a dull black, matted with mud and streaked with scars. The animal's ribs jutted sharply against its thin skin, and its eyes, wide and panicked, darted toward her. It stomped a hoof weakly, the sound echoing against the nearby graffiti-covered walls. "Whoa, easy," Emma whispered, stepping closer with her hands raised. She knew nothing about horses but recognized pain and neglect when she saw it. The horse snorted, jerking its head as the frayed rope bit into its neck. Emma could see how tightly it was tied, the cord cutting into raw flesh. The sight made her heart ache. "Who would do this to you?" she muttered, crouching at a safe distance. Over the next few minutes, she scanned the lot for signs of the horse's owner but saw no one. Nearby, she found an empty bucket tipped over, its smell indicating it had once held water. Her fingers brushed the rim, cold and dry. The animal had been abandoned, left to starve or worse. Emma pulled a stale roll from her pocket, a remnant from the shelter's lunch line earlier that day. "Here," she said, breaking the bread into pieces and tossing one toward the horse. "I'm not gonna hurt you." The horse hesitated, its nostrils flaring as it caught the scent of food. It stretched its neck, its movements cautious but desperate. When the bread disappeared into its mouth, Emma smiled faintly. "I'll call you Midnight," she said. "It suits you." Midnight's initial fear softened as Emma stayed, speaking in soothing tones. She talked about her parents, the streets, and her dreams of finding a place where she didn't feel invisible. Midnight didn't reply, of course, but his eyes seemed to hold something, an understanding of the loneliness she described. Hours passed, and the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the Detroit skyline in shades of gray and amber. Emma reluctantly stood, brushing dirt off her knees. "I'll be back tomorrow," she promised. "Don't give up, okay?" As she turned to leave, a voice startled her. "Hey, what are you doing there?" Emma spun around to see a man emerging from the shadows, his bulky frame clad in a dirty coat. His face was hard, his eyes narrowing as he approached. I wasn't doing anything," she stammered, backing away instinctively. "That's my property," he barked, pointing at Midnight. "You've got no business poking around here." Emma's heart pounded as she glanced at the horse, then back at the man. Midnight whinnied softly, his fear mirroring hers. "He's starving," she blurted, surprising herself with her boldness. "You can't just leave him like this." The man stepped closer, towering over her. "Mind your own business, kid. That thing's worthless." Emma clenched her fists, anger bubbling in her chest. "He's not worthless," the man scoffed, turning away with a muttered curse. "Get lost before I call the cops." Tears burned in Emma's eyes as she hurried out of the lot, but she didn't go far. Hidden behind a crumbling wall, she watched as the man disappeared into the night. Midnight's plight was etched into her heart. She knew she couldn't abandon him. Not now, not ever. Emma returned to the lot at dawn, the frost clinging to the weeds like fragile glass. She had spent the night huddled in the corner of an abandoned warehouse, her mind racing with thoughts of Midnight. His hollow eyes haunted her, a reminder that she couldn't turn her back on him. With her meager savings from collecting cans, she had bought a loaf of bread and a few apples from a corner store. It wasn't much, but it was all she could afford. As she slipped through the broken fence, Midnight's ears perked up, his head jerking toward the noise. The mistrust in his gaze hadn't vanished overnight, but there was a flicker of recognition when he saw her. "Hey, buddy," Emma whispered, keeping her voice low and steady. She moved slowly, pulling a small apple from her pocket. "I brought you something. Bet you're hungry, huh?" Midnight's nostrils flared as he caught the scent, his body tense but intrigued. Emma tossed the apple a few feet in front of him and waited. For a moment, he didn't move, his muscles taut with caution. Then, with a hesitant step, he reached for the fruit, crunching into it with a fervor that made Emma smile. "That's it," she murmured. "There's more where that came from if you let me get closer." Each day followed a similar routine. Emma would arrive early, bringing scraps of food and speaking to Midnight in soft tones. She told him stories about her parents, her love for books, and the dreams she used to have of becoming a veterinarian. Midnight never interrupted, but his growing calmness was answer enough. The turning point came on a particularly cold morning. Emma approached with her usual offering of bread, but this time, instead of waiting for her to toss it, Midnight stretched his neck toward her outstretched hand. The rough texture of his lips against her palm sent a thrill through her, a surge of hope she hadn't felt in years. "There you go," she said, her voice trembling with excitement. "See? I'm not so bad, am I?" She noticed the scars on Midnight's body in more detail now, the jagged line on his shoulder, the raw patches around his neck from the tight rope. Each mark told a story of pain and neglect, but also of survival. Over the next week, their bond deepened. Midnight began to nicker softly when he saw her approach, a sound that made her heart swell. She managed to loosen the rope around his neck, though she didn't dare remove it entirely yet. The thought of him running into the dangerous streets of Detroit kept her cautious. One afternoon, as Emma sat on an overturned crate near Midnight, she heard footsteps crunching on gravel. Her chest tightened as she turned to see a young man, probably in his 20s, standing a few feet away. He wore a threadbare hoodie and jeans, his hands stuffed into his pockets. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his tone low but firm. Emma stood, placing herself between the man and Midnight. "I'm not hurting anyone," she replied, her voice steady despite her racing heart. The man shook his head. "That horse belongs to people you don't want to mess with." Emma narrowed her eyes. "Then why are you here?" He sighed, glancing at Midnight. "I work for them, sometimes. Look, they don't care about the horse. They're planning to sell him off for meat. If they catch you messing around, it won't end well for you." Emma's stomach twisted, but she refused to back down. "Then help me," she said, her voice sharp with desperation. "If you know what they're doing is wrong, help me save him." The man hesitated, his gaze flickering between Emma and Midnight. For a moment, she thought he might walk away, but then he spoke. "You're crazy, kid," he muttered. "But I'll think about it." As he disappeared into the shadows, Emma turned back to Midnight, her resolve hardening. She didn't have time to wait for someone else to act. Midnight's life was in her hands now, and she wouldn't let him down. From that day forward, she began to plan in earnest, her mind racing with ideas for how to free Midnight and get him to safety. The bond they shared was no longer just about trust. It was about survival, for both of them. The frost on Detroit streets grew heavier with each passing day, and so did Emma's urgency. Midnight's condition was improving. His coat, though still dull, began to regain some of its natural sheen, and his ribs were slightly less pronounced. But Emma knew their time was running out. One late afternoon, as she crouched by Midnight, carefully untying another section of the rope that bound him, voices echoed from the other side of the lot. She froze, her hands still resting on the coarse fibers. "You know what they said," one gruff voice barked. "That horse ain't worth the feed. By Friday, we take care of it." Emma's stomach churned as she peeked through the weeds. Two men stood by the gate, one holding a cigarette while the other adjusted the straps of a worn leather jacket. "Should have been done last week," the second man grumbled, exhaling a puff of smoke. "I don't see why we're waiting. Scrap it and move on. Boss wants to see if anyone bites on the auction first," the first replied. "Meat's meat, whether it's running or not." Emma's breath caught in her throat. The words were like a punch to her gut. They weren't just neglecting Midnight, they were planning to kill him. Midnight shifted beside her, sensing her tension. She placed a calming hand on his neck, her fingers trembling against his warm, coarse mane. "Shua," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. "It's okay. I won't let them hurt you." The men lingered a while longer, discussing other matters, but their presence felt like a heavy cloud hanging over the lot. Emma stayed hidden until their voices faded and the gate clanged shut behind them. Her mind raced as she led Midnight to a corner of the lot, farther from prying eyes. The thought of those men returning made her chest tighten, but the memory of their words ignited a spark of determination. "We don't have much time, buddy," she said, looking into Midnight's dark, soulful eyes. "We need to get out of here." That evening, Emma found herself at a small diner downtown, her few coins spread on the counter as she nursed a cup of hot chocolate. She was brainstorming escape routes when the young man from before slid into the booth across from her. "You're still at it, huh?" he said, his voice low. Emma glared at him. "What do you care?" He leaned back, crossing his arms. "Look, I'm just saying you're messing with people who don't like their property being touched. You should stay out of it." "Property?" Emma snapped, her voice louder than she intended. She leaned forward, her hazel eyes blazing. "He's not property. He's a living, breathing creature, and they're going to kill him." The man glanced around nervously, lowering his voice. "Keep it down. You don't know these guys like I do. They won't think twice about scaring a kid, or worse." "I don't care," Emma shot back. "If you're so scared of them, then stay out of my way. But I'm not letting Midnight die because you're too much of a coward to do the right thing." For a moment, the man said nothing, his expression unreadable. Then he sighed, running a hand through his messy brown hair. "You're stubborn. I'll give you that." Emma crossed her arms, refusing to back down. Finally, he leaned forward, his tone softening. "If you're serious about this, you'll need help. They've got guys checking the lot at all hours now, and that rope isn't coming off without the right tools." Emma hesitated, her resolve faltering slightly. "You'll help me?" The man smirked faintly. "Let's just say I don't like those guys much either. Meet me tomorrow night. I'll bring what you need." Emma studied him carefully, searching for any sign of deception. When she found none, she nodded. "Fine, but if you try to double-cross me—" "Relax, kid," he interrupted, standing. "I've got better things to do than screw over a 10-year-old. As he walked away, Emma felt a strange mix of relief and apprehension. She didn't trust him fully, but she didn't have the luxury of turning down help. Back in the lot that night, she sat beside Midnight, her fingers combing through his mane as she whispered her plan. "Tomorrow, we start a new life," she said softly. "I don't know where we'll go, but anywhere is better than here." Midnight nuzzled her shoulder gently, as if to say he believed her. Emma closed her eyes, resting her head against his neck, and for the first time in a long time, allowed herself a sliver of hope. The following day dragged on as if time itself conspired against Emma. Every hour felt heavier, the weight of her plan looming over her like the frigid Detroit sky. She spent the day preparing, scrounging for supplies, and rehearsing her route out of the city in her mind. The River Rouge was her best bet, a narrow, winding path that led toward quieter areas, far from the prying eyes of the men she feared. As the sun dipped below the skyline, Emma returned to the abandoned lot. Midnight greeted her with a soft nicker, his once weary eyes now holding a spark of trust. "Tonight's the night, boy," she whispered, running a hand along his neck. "We're getting out of here." The young man, who she now knew as Ryan, arrived just as the first stars peeked through the clouds. He carried a small bag slung over his shoulder and wore a nervous expression that matched Emma's own. "You ready for this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Emma nodded. "Did you bring what we need?" Ryan opened the bag, revealing a pair of bolt cutters, a small flashlight, and a few pieces of sturdy rope. "These should do the trick. But once we start, there's no going back. You sure you're ready?" "I don't have a choice," Emma replied firmly. Ryan sighed. "All right then, let's move." The lot was eerily quiet, the only sounds the rustle of dry weeds and the distant hum of the city. Ryan held the flashlight steady as Emma worked to free the last of the ropes binding Midnight. The bolt cutters made quick work of the thick cord, and Midnight shifted nervously, sensing the tension in the air. "It's okay, Midnight," Emma whispered, her hands trembling as she stroked his muzzle. "We're almost there." Ryan glanced around nervously. "We need to move. Now." Emma nodded, looping the new rope around Midnight's neck like a makeshift lead. She tugged gently, guiding him toward the gap in the fence they'd scouted earlier. Midnight followed hesitantly, his hooves crunching softly against the frozen ground. As they neared the exit, a harsh voice shattered the quiet. "Hey, what the hell are you doing?" Emma's heart plummeted as one of the men from before stepped into view, his shadow stretching ominously under the streetlights. "Run," Ryan hissed, shoving Emma forward. Midnight balked, his instincts flaring at the sudden chaos. Emma tugged at the rope desperately. "Come on, Midnight. Please." The man started toward them, his hand reaching for something in his pocket. Emma didn't want to know what it was. "Stop," the man bellowed. But Midnight finally moved, breaking into a trot as Emma led him through the gap in the fence. Ryan held his ground, throwing a piece of debris toward the man to slow him down. "Go," Ryan yelled. Emma didn't look back, her focus entirely on keeping Midnight moving. They bolted through the lot, down the alley, and toward the riverbank. The sound of pursuing footsteps faded as they reached the water's edge. Emma collapsed onto the cold ground, gasping for breath. Midnight stood beside her, his sides heaving but steady. "You did it," she whispered, her voice cracking. "We did it." Ryan appeared moments later, panting and disheveled. "You're lucky he didn't have a gun," he muttered, leaning against a tree. Emma shot him a grateful look. "Thanks for everything." Ryan waved her off. "Just get him somewhere safe, all right? And stay out of trouble." She nodded, clutching the rope tightly as she looked toward the dark expanse of the River Rouge. It was the first step in a long journey, but for the first time, she felt like they had a fighting chance. "I will," she promised, her voice steady despite the fear bubbling inside her. As Ryan disappeared into the shadows, Emma turned to Midnight, her resolve hardening. "Let's go, boy. We've got a long way to go." With the city lights fading behind them, Emma led Midnight into the unknown, determined to find a safe haven where they could finally breathe free. The night air was sharp and unforgiving as Emma guided Midnight along the narrow path that snaked beside the River Rouge. Her legs ached, her hands were raw from gripping the rope, and her breath clouded in the freezing air. Midnight trudged behind her, his steps tentative but trusting. They were far from safe, and every rustle of leaves or distant sound of a car made Emma's heart leap in fear. "We've got to keep moving," she murmured to Midnight, as much to reassure herself as to motivate him. "We can't stop now." The terrain grew rougher as they moved farther from the city. Weeds and overgrowth tangled around her boots, and the occasional patch of ice made her stumble. Midnight snorted nervously when a low-hanging branch brushed his side, but Emma paused to stroke his muzzle. "It's okay, boy," she whispered. "Just a little further, I promise." By dawn, the city skyline was a faint blur on the horizon. Emma and Midnight had followed the river far into the outskirts, but their progress was slow. Emma's stomach growled, a gnawing reminder of how little she had eaten. Midnight, too, was flagging, his steps sluggish. "We need to rest," Emma admitted, spotting a cluster of trees that offered some semblance of cover. She led Midnight off the path, tying the rope loosely around a sturdy branch to keep him from wandering. As she rummaged through her bag, she found the last piece of bread and one apple. She held the bread in her hand, staring at it for a long moment before breaking it in half. "Here," she said, offering part to Midnight. "You need it more than I do." Midnight nuzzled her hand, his warm breath a small comfort against the chill. Emma watched him eat, her mind racing with worry. They needed food, shelter, and a plan to get farther away. The men from Detroit might already be looking for them. By late afternoon, Emma spotted the faint outline of a barn in the distance. Her heart leapt. It was risky, but she had no choice. Midnight needed rest, and so did she. The barn belonged to an elderly farmer named Mr. Tomlin, whose weathered face bore the marks of a lifetime spent in the sun. As Emma approached cautiously, leading Midnight behind her, Mr. Tomlin emerged from the barn, leaning on a cane. "Who's there?" he called, his voice gruff but not unkind. Emma stepped forward, her small frame trembling with exhaustion. "It's just me," she said hesitantly. "And my horse." Tomlin squinted at her, his sharp blue eyes taking in the sight of the thin, dirt-streaked girl and the weary animal at her side. "That's no horse," he muttered. "That's a skeleton with hooves. What are you doing out here with him?" Emma hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. We had to leave. It wasn't safe." Tomlin frowned but didn't press. Instead, he nodded toward the barn. "Get him inside before he collapses. And you'd better explain yourself." Inside the barn, the scent of hay and livestock was overwhelming, but it was warmer than the biting wind outside. Emma untied Midnight and led him into an empty stall, where he sank to his knees almost immediately. Tomlin appeared moments later with a bucket of water and a few carrots. "Let him drink slow," he instructed, setting the items down. Emma nodded, her gratitude overwhelming her. "Thank you. I'll do whatever I can to pay you back. I can clean the stalls, help with the animals, anything." Tomlin raised an eyebrow. "You're just a kid. What are you running from?" Emma bit her lip, her eyes welling up. "Bad people," she said simply. "They were going to hurt him. I couldn't let that happen." Tomlin studied her for a long moment before nodding. "You've got guts. I'll give you that. You can stay tonight, but come morning, you'll have to move on. Folks around here don't like trouble, and it sounds like you've got plenty of it." Emma's shoulders sagged with relief. "Thank you, Mr. Tomlin. I promise we'll leave first thing." As the old farmer shuffled away, Emma sat beside Midnight, her fingers gently stroking his mane. "We'll be okay, Midnight," she whispered, her voice soft but resolute. "We just need to keep going." Midnight nickered softly, his trust in her unwavering. Emma leaned against him, her exhaustion finally catching up. For the first time in days, she closed her eyes and allowed herself to rest, knowing that their journey was far from over, but feeling a glimmer of hope for the road ahead. The first rays of sunlight crept through the wooden slats of the barn, casting long shadows over the straw-strewn floor. Emma stirred awake, her body aching from the strain of the past days. Midnight was still lying beside her, his breathing steady. He looked stronger already, as though the few hours of shelter had begun to work their magic. Stretching, Emma rubbed her eyes and glanced around the barn. It was a modest structure, with a handful of stalls, most occupied by cows and goats. The faint aroma of hay mingled with the earthy scent of animals, creating an oddly comforting atmosphere. A gruff voice broke the silence. "Up and at 'em, kid. We've got work to do." Emma turned to see Mr. Tomlin leaning against the barn door, his cane in one hand and a steaming mug of coffee in the other. His sharp blue eyes held a mixture of impatience and curiosity. "I told you last night, if you want to stay even for a little while, you've got to pull your weight," he continued. "And I mean it." Emma scrambled to her feet, brushing straw from her clothes. "I'll do anything you need, sir. Just, please, don't make us leave yet." Tomlin grunted. "We'll see how you do. Start with the stalls. Muck him out and lay down fresh hay. After that, we'll talk." Emma threw herself into the work, her small hands blistering as she wielded the pitchfork. The tasks were exhausting, but they gave her a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. Midnight watched her from his stall, occasionally nickering softly, as if encouraging her. By mid-morning, Tomlin returned, his expression unreadable. "Not bad," he admitted, nodding toward the clean stalls. "Most kids your age would have quit halfway through." Emma wiped sweat from her brow, her heart lifting at the faint note of approval in his voice. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady. "I'll keep working. Whatever you need." Tomlin studied her for a long moment before sighing. "All right, kid. You and that horse of yours can stay a few more days. But don't get too comfortable. This isn't a charity." Emma nodded quickly, her gratitude evident. "Thank you, Mr. Tomlin. I promise we won't be any trouble." He grunted in response and turned to leave, but then paused. "What's his name?" "Midnight," Emma replied, glancing at the horse with a small smile. Tomlin nodded thoughtfully. Fitting. Take care of him, kid. He's a good-looking animal under all that neglect. Over the next few days, Emma worked tirelessly around the farm. She fed the animals, cleaned the barn, and even helped mend a section of the fence that had been damaged in a storm. Her bond with Midnight deepened as she cared for him, brushing his coat until it gleamed and ensuring he had plenty of water and hay. In the evenings, she sat with Tomlin in the small kitchen of his farmhouse, sharing simple meals of stew and cornbread. Though the old man was gruff and guarded, Emma began to sense a softer side to him. He didn't pry into her past, but his occasional questions hinted at a growing curiosity. So, he said one night, breaking the silence, "You've got guts, I'll give you that. But you're not the first stray to pass through these parts. What makes you think you can outrun whatever you're running from?" Emma hesitated, her spoon hovering over her bowl. "I don't know," she admitted quietly, "but I have to try. Midnight deserves a chance, and I guess I do too." Tomlin nodded slowly, his weathered face thoughtful. "Fair enough. Just remember, there's a fine line between bravery and foolishness." Emma's sense of security was shattered a few nights later when she overheard a conversation in town. While fetching supplies for Tomlin, she heard two men at the hardware store discussing a missing horse. "They're offering a reward," one of them said, his voice carrying. "Decent money for anyone who knows where that kid and her horse went." Emma's blood ran cold. The men from Detroit were looking for her and Midnight. She couldn't let them find him. That night, after Tomlin had gone to bed, Emma sat in the barn with Midnight, her hands trembling as she ran them through his mane. "We can't stay," she whispered, her voice cracking. "They'll find us here." Midnight nuzzled her shoulder, as if sensing her fear. Emma swallowed hard, her resolve hardening. The next morning, she approached Tomlin as he milked the goats. "We're leaving," she said firmly. He looked up, his expression neutral. "I figured as much. You're running out of time." Emma hesitated. "Thank you for everything." Tomlin waved her off. "Just keep that horse safe, kid. And yourself, too." As Emma led Midnight away from the farm, the weight of the unknown pressed heavily on her shoulders. The road ahead was uncertain, but she knew one thing for sure. She wouldn't let anything happen to Midnight. Not now, not ever. The path stretched endlessly before Emma as she guided Midnight farther into rural Wisconsin. The horizon was vast and empty, with rolling fields dotted with patches of forest. The landscape offered little in the way of shelter or supplies, but it was a stark contrast to the oppressive, crumbling streets of Detroit. Emma's thoughts lingered on Mr. Tomlin as they walked. He had been rough around the edges, but his kindness had been a rare and unexpected gift. Leaving his farm felt like leaving behind a lifeline, but she knew she couldn't stay, not with the men from Detroit hunting them. By mid-afternoon, Emma spotted a small creek running parallel to the dirt road. Midnight's ears perked up, and she led him toward it, her own parched throat grateful for the sight of water. As Midnight drank deeply, Emma knelt by the bank, cupping her hands to gather the icy liquid. "You're getting stronger," she said to Midnight, smiling as she watched him. His coat, once dull and patchy, now had a faint sheen. His eyes, once fearful, were calm and trusting. They rested briefly before continuing their journey, the crunch of their footsteps the only sound in the still air. Emma scanned the horizon constantly, her nerves on edge. She hadn't seen any signs of pursuit, but the memory of the reward being mentioned in town kept her vigilance sharp. By dusk, they reached a small, weathered farmhouse with a sagging roof and an empty pasture. It looked abandoned, but Emma hesitated. Experience had taught her that appearances could be deceiving. She led Midnight to the edge of the property and waited, her heart pounding. The house remained silent, the windows dark. With a deep breath, Emma approached the barn, its doors slightly ajar. Inside, the space was dusty and cluttered with old tools and rotting hay, but it offered enough shelter for the night. "Looks like we've found a place to stay, at least for now," Emma said, patting Midnight's neck. As she worked to settle him in, she heard the distant rumble of a vehicle. Panic surged through her, and she crouched low, peering through a crack in the barn door. A rusted pickup truck rolled down the dirt road, its headlights slicing through the dim light. Emma held her breath, watching as the truck passed without slowing. Her legs felt like jelly as she sank back onto the barn floor. Midnight nickered softly, nudging her shoulder. "Yeah, I'm scared too," she whispered, resting her head against his. "But we'll be okay. We have to be." The next morning, Emma woke to the sound of footsteps crunching outside the barn. Her eyes snapped open, her body rigid with fear. Someone was coming. Before she could hide, the barn door creaked open and an older woman stepped inside. She was tall and lean, her weathered face framed by graying hair tied back in a braid. Her sharp eyes immediately landed on Emma, then shifted to Midnight. "What are you doing in my barn?" the woman demanded, her voice firm but not unkind. Emma scrambled to her feet, her heart racing. "I'm sorry," she stammered. "We didn't mean to trespass. We just needed a place to stay." The woman folded her arms, studying Emma closely. "That your horse?" Emma nodded quickly. "Yes, ma'am. His name's Midnight." The woman's expression softened slightly. "He's a fine-looking animal. Looks like he's been through hell, though." "He has," Emma said quietly. "So have I." The woman sighed, motioning for Emma to sit. "Name's Mrs. Hargrove," she said. "I'm not one for turning folks away, especially kids. But I need to know what you're running from." Emma hesitated, her hands fidgeting in her lap. "There are people looking for Midnight. They want to hurt him. I couldn't let that happen." Mrs. Hargrove nodded thoughtfully. "Well, you're safe here for now. But if you're in trouble, you'd better have a plan." "I do," Emma said, her voice steady. "We're heading west, to Montana. There's a place there that takes in animals like Midnight." Mrs. Hargrove arched a brow. "That's a long way for a kid on foot. You sure you can make it?" Emma met her gaze, her hazel eyes fierce with determination. "I have to." The older woman smiled faintly. "You remind me of my granddaughter. Stubborn as a mule. All right, you can stay for a couple of days. But you'll have to earn your keep." Emma nodded eagerly. "Thank you, Mrs. Hargrove. I'll do whatever you need." Over the next 2 days, Emma helped repair fences, feed chickens, and clear brush around the property. Midnight was given a proper stall with fresh hay and clean water, and Mrs. Hargrove even found an old saddle she thought might fit him. As Emma prepared to leave, Mrs. Hargrove handed her a small bundle. Inside were a few sandwiches, a bottle of water, and a folded map. "You'll need this," the woman said, her voice gruff to mask her concern. "And if you ever need help, come back here. I won't ask questions." Emma's eyes filled with tears as she hugged Mrs. Hargrove tightly. "Thank you for everything. Take care of that horse," Mrs. Hargrove said, her voice softening. "And yourself." With Midnight saddled and the map in hand, Emma set off once more, her heart heavy but her resolve unshaken. The road ahead was long and uncertain, but she felt stronger knowing there were still people like Mrs. Hargrove willing to help a girl and her horse find their way. The wind whipped across the plains as Emma and Midnight continued their trek westward. The sandwiches Mrs. Hargrove had packed were gone within 2 days, leaving Emma rationing the last of her water and a few scraps of bread she'd scavenged. Midnight fared better with the hay Mrs. Hargrove had tucked into his saddlebag, but Emma worried constantly about his strength. As they approached a small town on the outskirts of Iowa, Emma's nerves were on edge. She'd avoided populated areas since leaving Detroit, but her dwindling supplies left her no choice. With a deep breath, she guided Midnight toward the town, keeping to the shadows of back alleys and quieter streets. The town was modest, with a main street lined with mom-and-pop shops, a gas station, and a diner. Emma's gaze darted to the diner, where the smell of fried food made her stomach ache with longing. She tethered Midnight to a post behind the building, stroking his neck reassuringly. "I'll be quick," she promised. "Stay quiet, okay?" She slipped into the diner through the back door, her small frame unnoticed among the bustle of waitresses and cooks. She approached a table where an older couple had left half-eaten plates of pancakes and eggs. Her hands shook as she reached for the leftovers, but before she could take a bite, a voice froze her in place. "What do you think you're doing, kid?" Emma turned slowly, her face burning with shame. A waitress in her 40s stood there, her hands on her hips and an exasperated look in her eyes. "I'm sorry," Emma whispered, tears welling up. I'm just hungry. The waitress softened, her stern demeanor melting into something kinder. Sit down, she said, motioning to an empty booth. I'll get you something fresh. Emma hesitated. I don't have any money. The waitress waved her off. Don't worry about it. Just sit. Minutes later, Emma was devouring a plate of eggs and toast, her body trembling with gratitude and relief. The waitress, who introduced herself as Marie, sat across from her, watching with a mix of curiosity and concern. You're not from around here, Marie said, pouring Emma a glass of orange juice. Emma shook her head, swallowing quickly. I'm heading west.
To Montana.
Marie raised an eyebrow. That's a long way for a girl like you. You traveling alone? Emma hesitated, then nodded. Just me and my horse, Midnight. A horse? Marie's expression turned serious. You're not running from something, are you? Emma's silence was answer enough. Marie sighed, leaning back in the booth. Listen, I don't know what kind of trouble you're in, but you should be careful. Small towns like this? People talk, and if someone's looking for you, they'll hear about it fast. Emma's stomach twisted. I'll leave soon, she said quickly. I just needed food. Marie reached into her apron pocket, pulling out a $20 bill. She slid it across the table. Take this. Get yourself more supplies and keep moving. And if anyone asks, I didn't see you. Emma's eyes filled with tears as she took the money. Thank you, she whispered. Be smart, kid, Marie said, standing. And take care of that horse. Emma left the diner with a full stomach and a renewed sense of purpose. She stopped at a small grocery store to buy water, apples, and a loaf of bread before returning to Midnight. As she untied him, a low voice from behind startled her. That your horse? Emma spun around to see a man in a faded baseball cap leaning against a nearby wall. His sharp eyes and casual stance sent a chill down her spine. Yes, she said cautiously. The man smirked. Funny. Saw a flyer back in Detroit looking for a horse that looks just like that. Big reward, too. Emma's blood ran cold. She gripped Midnight's rope tightly, her heart pounding. You must be mistaken, she said, her voice shaking. The man stepped closer, his smirk widening. Maybe, or maybe I should make a call and find out. Before he could react, Emma yanked on Midnight's rope and bolted, her legs pumping as she ran toward the outskirts of town. The man shouted after her, but she didn't dare look back. Midnight followed her lead, his hooves pounding against the ground as they raced away. The town disappeared behind them, replaced by open fields and the rising moon. Emma didn't stop until her legs gave out, and even then, she only allowed herself a moment to breathe. She leaned against Midnight, her tears hot against the cool night air. We can't trust anyone, she whispered, her voice breaking. But we'll keep going. I promise. Midnight nickered softly, his quiet strength giving her the courage to continue. She wiped her eyes, adjusted the saddlebag, and pressed on, the road ahead darker and more uncertain than ever. The open plains of Iowa stretched endlessly before Emma and Midnight. The dirt roads and vast fields, dotted with occasional clusters of trees, provided both freedom and isolation. Emma knew they were heading in the right direction, west, but every step carried the weight of uncertainty. Supplies were limited, and the growing cold was a constant reminder that winter was fast approaching. The encounter with the man in the town lingered in Emma's mind, gnawing at her nerves. The realization that someone might have identified Midnight fueled her urgency. She pushed herself and Midnight harder, traveling farther each day, pausing only when exhaustion demanded it. On the fourth day of their journey through the plains, Emma spotted a farmhouse in the distance. Unlike the worn-down structure she had passed earlier, this one was well-maintained, with smoke curling from the chimney and a small herd of cattle grazing nearby. A weathered sign at the edge of the property read, Hollis Family Farm. Emma hesitated, weighing the risk of approaching the farm against the desperate need for shelter and food. Midnight nudged her shoulder as if encouraging her. All right, she whispered, but if things seem wrong, we leave. No questions asked. The farmhouse door creaked open to reveal a middle-aged woman with kind, weathered eyes and a gray braid trailing down her back. She wiped her hands on an apron as she stepped onto the porch. Can I help you? the woman asked, her tone cautious but not unfriendly. Emma swallowed hard, gripping Midnight's lead rope tightly. I'm traveling west, she said, her voice steady despite her nerves. I was wondering if I could rest here for a night. I'll work for food and a place to stay. The woman studied Emma and Midnight for a long moment before nodding. Name's Martha Hollis, she said, motioning for Emma to follow her. Bring your horse around to the barn. My husband will want to take a look at him. Inside the barn, Emma met Joe Hollis, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a quiet demeanor. He examined Midnight with a practiced hand, his brow furrowed as he noted the horse's scars and lean frame. This one's been through hell, Joe said, looking at Emma, but he's got good bones. You've taken good care of him. Emma nodded, her voice soft. He's my best friend. Joe grunted in approval. Well, he'll get a proper meal and a warm stall tonight. You'll do the same if you're willing to help around the place. Relief washed over Emma, and she nodded eagerly. I'll do anything you need. Over the next 2 days, Emma worked tirelessly alongside the Hollises. She helped Martha in the kitchen, peeling potatoes and baking bread, and assisted Joe with feeding the cattle and stacking hay. Midnight thrived under Joe's care, his energy returning as he ate fresh alfalfa and drank from the farm's clean troughs. At night, Emma sat by the fireplace with the Hollises, savoring the warmth and the rare feeling of safety. Martha, ever perceptive, asked gentle questions about Emma's journey. You've got a long way to Montana, Martha said one evening, sipping her tea. What's waiting for you there? Emma hesitated, staring into the flames. There's a place that takes in animals like Midnight. A sanctuary. I heard about it from someone back in Detroit. Martha's gaze softened. You're braver than most grown folks I know, taking on a journey like this. But it's dangerous, Emma. Do you have a plan if things go wrong? Emma shook her head, tears threatening to spill. I just know I have to get him there. He's all I have. Martha reached over, placing a comforting hand on Emma's shoulder. You've got us for now. We'll help you however we can. On the third morning, Emma woke to find Joe loading a small wagon with supplies. He waved her over, handing her a carefully folded map and a handwritten note. That's a letter for a friend of mine in Nebraska, he explained. He runs a ranch and might be able to help you. Follow the route I marked. It's the safest way. Emma's throat tightened as she looked at the Hollises. I don't know how to thank you. Martha hugged her gently. You already have. You've reminded us what courage looks like. Emma mounted Midnight, clutching the reins tightly. She waved to the Hollises as they stood on the porch, their figures growing smaller as she rode away. The kindness of strangers like the Hollises gave Emma hope, but the road ahead remained perilous. With each passing mile, she felt the weight of her mission pressing down on her. To protect Midnight, no matter what. As the plains stretched endlessly before her, Emma whispered a promise to herself and to Midnight. We're going to make it. I don't know how, but we will. The wind carried her words away, but the determination in her voice lingered, as unyielding as the vast horizon before them. The days bled into weeks as Emma and Midnight pressed onward, crossing into Nebraska. The map Joe Hollis had given her became her lifeline, guiding her through back roads and quiet trails that kept them far from prying eyes. Her bond with Midnight deepened as they weathered every challenge together. Sudden storms, freezing nights, and the relentless ache of hunger. Emma clung to the hope that Joe's friend would be as kind as the Hollises. By the time she reached the small ranch marked on the map, exhaustion had settled deep into her bones. The wooden sign hanging above the gate read, Bright Horizons Ranch, and the sight of it filled Emma with cautious optimism. As she guided Midnight through the gate, a man in his 60s emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. He was tall and wiry, with a neatly trimmed beard and a cowboy hat that shaded his weathered face. He paused when he saw Emma, his sharp blue eyes taking in the girl and her horse. You must be Emma, he said, his voice calm and steady. Joe told me to expect you. Name's Frank Harris. Emma nodded, gripping Midnight's lead rope tightly. Thank you for letting us come. I don't mean to cause trouble. Frank chuckled softly. You've had enough trouble already, from the looks of it. Let's get that horse settled, and then you can tell me your story. The ranch was sprawling, with rolling pastures and sturdy fences. Midnight was given a large stall in the main barn, complete with fresh hay and clean water. Frank inspected the horse with a practiced eye, nodding in approval. "He's a strong one," Frank said, brushing Midnight's coat, "but he's been through hell. You've done a good job keeping him going." Emma felt a swell of pride at the compliment. "He's all I have," she said softly. Frank studied her for a moment before gesturing toward the farmhouse. "Come on. You look like you could use a hot meal and a good night's sleep." That evening, Emma sat at Frank's kitchen table, savoring a hearty bowl of stew. The warmth of the room, with its crackling fire and faint smell of wood polish, was a stark contrast to the cold, harsh nights she'd spent on the road. Frank listened intently as Emma recounted her journey, his expression serious but kind. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair, his gaze thoughtful. "You've got guts, kid," he said. "Most people wouldn't have made it this far." Emma hesitated. "Do you think we'll make it to Montana?" Frank smiled faintly. "I think you've already proven you can handle more than most, but you won't have to do it alone. I'll help you get there." Emma's eyes widened. "You will?" Frank nodded. "There's a transport leaving from here in a few days. A truck heading west with a load of supplies. I'll arrange for Midnight to travel with them, and I'll find someone trustworthy to take you the rest of the way." Tears filled Emma's eyes as she realized the enormity of his offer. "Thank you," she whispered. "I don't know how to repay you." Frank's smile softened. "You don't need to. Just promise me you'll never give up on that horse, or yourself." The next few days passed in a blur of preparation. Midnight's health improved rapidly under Frank's care, and Emma found herself laughing for the first time in months as she helped around the ranch. She felt a sense of belonging she hadn't known since losing her parents. When the day of departure arrived, Emma stood beside Midnight as the truck was loaded. Frank handed her a small envelope. "It's not much," he said, his tone gruff, "but it should help you get started when you reach Montana." Emma hugged him tightly, her voice choked with emotion. "You've done for us, Mr. Harris." "Thank you." Frank patted her shoulder, his rough hand surprisingly gentle. "You just take care of yourself and that horse. And remember, there's good people in the world. You've just got to keep finding them." The journey west was smoother than Emma expected. The truck driver, a kind older man named Charlie, treated Midnight with care and made sure Emma had snacks and blankets for the cold nights. Midnight, tucked safely into the truck's spacious compartment, seemed at ease, as though he understood this was the final leg of their journey. As they approached Montana, the landscape shifted to rolling hills and snow-dusted mountains. Emma felt a mix of awe and relief. She was finally nearing the sanctuary she had dreamed of. When they reached the town closest to the sanctuary, Charlie stopped the truck and pointed Emma toward a dirt road. "It's about 3 miles up that way," he said. "You'll find the place easy enough." Emma nodded, her heart pounding with anticipation. "Thank you, Charlie, for everything." He smiled warmly. "You're a tough kid, Emma. You and Midnight deserve a good life. Now go get it." Emma led Midnight down the dirt road, the towering mountains ahead a breathtaking backdrop. Her legs were sore, and the wind bit at her cheeks, but she didn't care. Each step brought her closer to safety, to a future she could barely dare to imagine. When they rounded the final bend, Emma gasped. The sanctuary was a sprawling haven, with wide pastures, sturdy barns, and a handful of people tending to horses, goats, and even a few dogs. A large wooden sign over the entrance read, "Freedom Fields Sanctuary." Emma approached cautiously, her heart hammering. A woman in her 40s, with kind eyes and a warm smile, spotted her and came over. "Hi there," the woman said, her gaze flicking to Midnight. "You must be Emma. Joe and Frank told us to expect you." Emma's throat tightened as she nodded. "This is Midnight," she said, her voice trembling. The woman extended a hand, gently stroking Midnight's muzzle. "He's beautiful, and lucky to have someone like you looking out for him. My name's Claire. Welcome to Freedom Fields." Over the next few days, Emma and Midnight settled into their new home. Midnight was given a spacious stall and plenty of room to roam, while Emma was offered a small cabin near the main barn. Claire and the other workers at the sanctuary welcomed her warmly, treating her not as a guest, but as part of their family. Emma quickly fell into a routine, helping with the horses and learning more about the sanctuary's mission. She discovered that Freedom Fields had been founded to give abused and neglected animals a second chance, a purpose that resonated deeply with her. One crisp morning, as Emma watched Midnight gallop freely across the pasture, tears filled her eyes. For the first time in years, she felt safe. She felt whole. Claire joined her, leaning on the fence beside her. "He's thriving," she said, nodding toward Midnight. "And so are you." Emma smiled through her tears. "It's all I ever wanted, for him to be happy." Claire placed a hand on Emma's shoulder. "You gave him that, and you gave yourself a chance to. You're stronger than you know, Emma." As the weeks turned into months, Emma grew into her new life at the sanctuary. Midnight became a symbol of resilience for everyone who visited, his story inspiring others to believe in second chances. Emma, too, found her place, learning to care for the animals and dreaming of a future where she could help more creatures like Midnight. Though the journey had been long and fraught with challenges, Emma and Midnight had finally found what they had been searching for: a home, a purpose, and the promise of a brighter tomorrow. Leave a like, subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and if you made it this far, comment "I made it this far" and share your thoughts about this story. Oh, and don't forget to watch the next video that's showing on the end screen. It's super exciting.